For weeks now, the airwaves, including here on GB News, have been clogged with the kind of political soap opera that makes EastEnders look like a quiet night in. Yes, it's the endless saga of Rupert Lowe and Reform UK. But the big question, perhaps the most important question, is whether this bust-up has dented their chances of nicking a few councils. And what about Angela Rayner's devolution bill? That grand plan to redraw the map of England while cancelling votes quicker than a Romanian Supreme Court ruling. She's axed elections in 9 areas, leaving 5 million voters without a say to push through those reforms. Reform say they're fuming. They've been robbed of a shot at glory. So, to crunch the numbers and make sense of this bin fire, essentially, we're joined by electoral calculus polling data scientist Marwan Riach, joining us for tonight's blockbuster interview. He's here to offer an expert analysis of the data and its implications for Reform UK's performance so far. Marwan, fantastic for you to join us tonight. Thank you. Give us your overview then of how Reform is doing in the polls and what is it looking like running up until those very important, crucial local elections?
Thank you, Alex. So good evening to you and your viewers. The poll we ran between the 1st of March and the 10th of March for the Telegraph asked over 5,000 people how they intend to vote in the local elections coming up this year. And the headline numbers are that Reform are set to win the second most seats behind the Conservatives. If the elections that have been delayed were set to take place this year and weren't delayed, we would have actually seen Reform topping the poll and winning the most council seats out of all the major parties.
Wow.
So let's look at where Reform are doing well. So they would have done very well in Thurrock, but of course that's had a delay. When it comes to Reform's campaign in Doncaster, they're off to the races. They are projected to win Doncaster directly from Labour. Now, there is some bright news for the Conservatives and Kemi Badenoch. We predict that they will win outright 3 councils in Leicestershire, Wiltshire and Buckinghamshire. And we don't predict Labour will win any councils. But they didn't have many. They only had 1 council to begin with, and that was Doncaster.
Interesting. So it looks to me that sounds to me like these devolution plans have really put a pin in Reform, a big celebration perhaps to say they've won this year's council elections. Do you think the Tories will be able to claim victory now as a result of those councils not being able to have a vote on them?
It's a good question. I think they are in a much better position than they would have been had the delayed elections gone ahead. So there would have been elections in places like Norfolk where we would have actually expected Reform to win outright, and that's a traditional Tory heartland. So this is a blessing in disguise for Kemi Badenoch, and I think questions surrounding her leadership will be put to one side because she can claim, as if our predictions are correct, she will have won the most council seats of any major party.
And what about this fallout between Rupert Lowe and Reform UK? Has that dented, in your opinion and your analysis, their chances of doing better, perhaps, in these council elections? And of course, after that, I'd just like to ask you about the Runcorn by-election as well, too.
Sure. So on the Reform Lowe Farage debacle, I think it's too early to tell. When you have national news about a party, it takes about 2 weeks for it to filter through to the data that we see. But let's suppose that 10% of Reform supporters are now put off. And rather than voting for another party, they just stay at home. That could mean they lose, in percentage point terms, about 3 points. And because of the nature of first past the post, that could mean them losing, or rather winning 40 seats post-debacle, as opposed to the 150, 160 seats that we currently have them on. So I would say to your viewers, keep your eyes peeled, look at what the opinion polls are saying in the next few weeks, because we need to also take into account that this fallout happened last Friday, and most polling and surveying hasn't taken place since that date. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for what opinion polls are saying. If Reform drop by 3 or 4 points, then it's potentially detrimental.
And just one final question for me, and I'd like I know some of the panel here would like to ask you some questions too. Final question, the Runcorn by-election coming up. How are Reform looking in the position they are in as of today? Obviously, we don't know what the impacts of this fallout might be, but are they looking in pole position to take that seat? And is this a big test for Nigel Farage's Reform UK?
It is a test. So by-elections are not necessarily representative of how people would vote in a general election, because it's how people can vent their frustration at the major parties. But in a general election, we would expect Labour to very narrowly hold that seat. And when I say narrowly, by about 2 or 3%, so it's within the margin of error. Now, Lord Ashcroft released a poll in Runcorn and Helsby a few days ago, which had Reform with a 9-point lead. That would be alarming. And there was a good post by a polling aggregator called Britain Elects that critiqued the methodology used because it samples a lot of people in Runcorn, the town itself, but doesn't ask a lot of the people who are living in the Cheshire commuter areas who are less Reform friendly. So I think if Reform win Runcorn handsomely, then they'd be on course to form the next government. If Labour narrowly win, then I think it's all to play for.
Interesting. Dr. Rayner, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi Marwan. I think that was really interesting when you broke down the changes that the devolution is going to make to voting intention. It was very interesting when it became clear that Labour were going to move these elections, that the Tories stayed very quiet. They said absolutely nothing. Do you think that was a deliberate ploy because this actually benefits them?
I don't know if it was a deliberate ploy, but it's certainly convenient for the Labour Party and the Conservative Party to delay those local elections, because with those elections being delayed, it will stop Reform, according to our predictions, topping the poll nationally.
Interesting stuff. OK. Marwan, I want to thank you so much for coming on to GB News this evening. This is really interesting. I'm sure we'll have you back closer to the elections to see what that fallout between Rupert Lowe and Reform UK might end up looking like. Thanks for coming on tonight. And still to come, can the Green Party...
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been over a week since Reform erupted into civil war, with Rupert Lowe being referred to the police. I'm not going to relitigate the allegations against him. Frankly, I think they are trumped up. I think they are grubby. I think there is very little substance to them at all. The usual caveats: Nigel Farage's popularity has got Reform to where it is today, and I think on balance he remains the best chance of electoral success for the party. But some hard truths need to be said at the same time. The first hard truth is that what they have done to Rupert Lowe, a good man, has been morally reprehensible. And if this is the way that they treat members of their party, they are not going to be able to encourage talented people in if there is a chance that if you get on the wrong side of Nigel Farage, you will have your character brutally assassinated, you'll be dragged through the mud, and your efforts will be discredited. The second thing is that it is very obvious that Nigel Farage over a long period of time has struggled to be able to pull together a winning team. It's a cliche to say, but it is true that Nigel Farage has killed more right-wing political careers than any Labor Party member in this country. He needs to show that he can actually manage a good team as opposed to being a presidential-like figure, which my instinct is secretly I think he would quite like. On the evidence of what we saw on TV recently when he answered this question in this clip, I don't think that he's learning that lesson. Let's see it.
People who've worked with you in the past would say, you're the repeat offender here, always having massive bust-ups with people. Here we go again.
I don't fall out with anybody. They fall out with me. You know what? Most of the team that I work with in this party are people that have been around me for over a decade. I am a team player. I do work with people. I do it for the long term.
They're not the words of a mature political leader. They're the words of a toddler. If Reform is going to be a successful government, not just win, but actually be successful as a government, Nigel needs to show that he can manage a team better. He needs to drop this messianic approach to leadership. They need to continue democratisation efforts. And quite frankly, he needs to behave better than what he has throughout this saga.